And today's presentation is Trees and Their Environmental Benefits with Dr. Richard Harper, Professor of Urban and Community Forestry at University of Massachusetts. And Rick Harper began his extension career at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Westchester County. He's currently an Extension Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and is an ISA Board Certified Master Arborist. Rick teaches courses in urban and community forestry and human dimensions of natural resources, and he administers an applied integrated research and extension program in urban forestry. Rick received his Ph.D. in forest resources arboriculture from UMass. Welcome, Rick, and thank you so much.
Well, hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I guess I should say it's great to be back. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Amy, and thank you, everybody, for coming today. This is actually, you all know that I love trees. I always start every class when I'm here on campus by telling people that I love thinking about trees, reading about trees, and talking about trees. So it's fun to be here, and it's always fun to talk a little bit about trees. So we'll get into a discussion today about urban tree health, about the benefits of urban trees. In fact, we'll start right off with benefits of urban trees, and we'll try to speak to some bigger picture issues related to maintaining and even enhancing the health of our urban trees. Trees are a little bit like people in that if we want people to be productive, they need to be happy and healthy. And so if we want trees to be productive, they too need to be healthy and in good status in that regards. And we love all those benefits associated with trees. So we'll dig into that in a little bit. I always welcome emails and correspondence from folks and try to respond as quickly as possible. I'm at the point now up here where we get probably between 60 and 100 emails a day. So things do sometimes get a little bit lost, but thanks, Amy, for resending that link this morning. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda today, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. I'm going to touch on a few different things. We'll touch on the background related to urban forestry and growing trees in the urban environment. This is the, I would say Dubois, but they say Du Bois Library here on campus. And you can see, of course, it's surrounded by vegetation. This was on a tree walk with Dr. Michael Durr. Mike Durr actually graduated from UMass here in horticulture years ago. And so he comes back and does tree walks and leads those sorts of sessions, which is wonderful. So we'll talk a little bit about the background related to urban trees. We'll talk about some cases from the field. And I reached back into my memory bank and some old photos and stories from Westchester. So hopefully that will, well, for me, that'll bring back some great memories. And then we'll talk a little bit about, of course, tree requirements and our understanding related to tree requirements. As you can see from the slide on the right-hand side, trees are really not designed per se to grow among asphalt and utility lines and other sorts of things in the urban environment that we take for granted. So we'll talk a little bit about what we know in terms of tree requirements. We'll talk about the importance of good practices throughout the chain of custody, whether that's where trees are grown, where trees are selected, trees are installed. There's all sorts of good tips that we can pass along in this regard for sure. And then, of course, we'll talk about some of the resources. And if you happen to be like myself, and my kids love to tease me, right? Because we have almost 16-year-old and almost 15-year-old in the house. So they say things like, Dad, you're so out of touch. But if you're like me and you like to take notes, pen and paper, then I want you to write down the following URL, because I will have several specific endings for that URL. But write down www.tinyurl.com, www.tinyurl.com, and I will have several different endings for that particular URL, tinyurl.com. So I think and then of course we'll try to leave some time at the end for some questions and answers and discussion as I kind of get a chance to reconnect with some of my old friends and colleagues here. So it's great to be back. All right, so our understanding of the urban forest, well, urban forestry per se is really a pretty new discipline. It's really only been around formally since the 1970s. And in terms of sort of our colloquial day-to-day understanding, really since the 1990s, the America the Beautiful initiative from the first President Bush and putting urban forestry in the Farm Bill in 1990 really sort of created the platform and the environment for urban forestry to kind of commence and grow in terms of people's understanding. So it's a pretty new discipline. And when I talk to folks about urban forestry, I kind of get that characteristic head tilt, like, what's that? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? And I suppose it is from some standpoints, but basically we're talking about an area, an environment where socio-ecological systems interact. And by that, we're talking about biophysical factors. These are tactile elements in the urban environment. So of course, we're talking about trees, and there are perhaps affiliated pests and other forms of infrastructure like we're looking at here in the screen, or that we saw a little bit earlier when we were looking at the trees growing around the Dubois Library. Other forms of hardscape, those sorts of tactile elements are those biophysical factors, and they of course intersect with the social elements, right? The social and political factors in the urban environment. So what we believe, what we value, what those that have the opportunity and the influence to be policymakers and decision makers believe and value. And of course, managers and employees, the rank and file folks that care for our trees, that care for the urban environment. Those are both folks in the public and private sector. And I started off as a private arborist in Westchester County before I worked for Cooperative Extension, before my 10 plus years in Westchester. So all of these different elements, which are complex in and of themselves, sort of come together. And Leopold talked about these different factors and the merger of sort of the social and the biophysical factors and how important that would be. And he was talking about that back in the 1930s, so almost 100 years ago, and how that would be really important for us to tackle that back in the 20th century. And of course, we're still very much talking about that well into the 21st century. So we're talking about a pretty complex environment when we're talking about the urban environment. And that naturally leads us, by virtue of the fact that we're talking about things from the subjective standpoint, to think about our relationship to nature and to think about our relationship to greenery and urban greenery. And we have several elements in terms of theoretical framework through which we view our relationship to nature. E.O. Wilson from Harvard talked about biophilia and our inherent connection to nature, the fact that we like to live near water, the fact that we like to be around greenery and take actually great comfort from a physiological standpoint from these sorts of things. Kaplan did a lot of great work back in the 80s, and indeed still well into the 21st century, about what's termed attention restoration. This is where we're talking about the fact that nature is engaging, it's fascinating, and there's a restorative element to being in nature. And we see this, even if we don't have a window where we can see outside of our office, people often have what in their office? They often have plants, or they often have pictures of scenery, those sorts of things. So again, there's a kind of an interconnectedness between biophilia and attention restoration. I had a colleague up here, his name was Dave Kittredge. Professor Kittredge actually passed away a few years ago, but I remember chatting with him. He had some cognitive issues in terms of actual brain health. He had brain cancer, but I remember talking with him, and he said, you know, Rick, it is exhausting when I go through my emails and try to answer emails. And I told you before that we all get lots of emails up here. There's lots of emails going around these days, lots of electronic communication indeed. But nature is sort of the opposite of that. So we like to unplug from our phones and our tablets and all sorts of electronic things because they drain us, but nature is mentally restorative. And then stress reduction theory, again, very much along these sorts of lines. Ulrich was a planner, landscape architect, did a lot of great work back in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s. And this relates to a lot of really cool things where he did studies related to prisoners and if they could see vegetation, or if there were hospitals, if you could see some vegetation through your window, you actually could have a shorter hospital stay. So again, the fact that there's actual health benefits, tangible health benefits, because we can see and interact with green spaces in nature, because it's engaging, because it's restorative, it reduces our stress. It speaks to the fact that we have this inherent connection to the natural world. So there's been lots of work done, or some important work done over the last 20 years related to getting our hands around how we interact with these green spaces and how we understand what our urban trees mean to us from a benefit standpoint. And I really do want to mention, of course, these two studies here at the bottom. This is a 2012 study and a 2018 study that came out from Dr. Dave Nowak. He's become a friend of mine over the years, and Eric Greenfield. I've not met Eric before. We've corresponded a little bit, but great specialists from the Forest Service. And if you ever get a chance to read a book by Jill Jones, Jonnes, she's a popular author and put out a book in 2016 simply called Urban Forests. It's a great book where she details the history of urban forestry here in the US and talks about sort of the early years back in the late 80s, early 90s with Dave Nowak and the folks out in, at that time in Chicago, and Mayor Daley, and all of the things that were going on in terms of the budding of urban forestry, if you will. So they've done a lot of great work that's involved ground-based protocols. When we're talking about ground-based protocols, the Forest Service has these forest inventory analysis plots, FIA, these plots all over the country. And they're both in, you typically think of them being traditional forest settings, more rural type settings, but they're also in the urban environment. And that's basically to monitor how trees grow, what's happening in terms of our urban trees, or our trees in general, and specifically even our urban trees. They also looked at paired image analysis over several years, comparing what's going on in cities, comparing what's going on in census-defined areas, again, to try to get hands around what's happening with our urban vegetation. And then, of course, I'm going to speak at the end, and perhaps if we get a chance to come back in the future, I can actually even go in and do a little bit of demonstrations in iTree. But what they talk about, of course, estimating the benefits and values of these trees using iTree. And we used to do, of course, our tree steward training in Westchester, and I'm sure that's still going on right now. But Dave Bloniars, who was one of the inventors along with Dave Nowak, Bloniars is up here on campus, and we get a chance to work together. In fact, we teach together. So he's one of the inventors of iTree, and you know, we could do some demonstrations related to that at some point in the future. So all of this important work has been done over the years, looking at these inventory analysis plots, looking at aerial photos, you know, using the analysis tools associated with iTree to try to get a handle around what we have in terms of urban tree cover, urban tree canopy cover. Sometimes you'll see UTCC with a percentage after that. And that's in relation to trying to understand how much actual tree canopy there is in our urban environments. And of course, as you can imagine, states that typically have more natural forest, like here in the Northeast, in the Southeast, have more forest cover, or certainly the potential for more forest cover in their urban settings, as opposed to other states that you think of, again, the Midwest, the far West, those sorts of places that don't have as much tree cover naturally, and they're really not a forested biome. That's what we live here in the Northeast. If you leave an area of land fallow, it's probably going to quote unquote revert to forest land. So we see here that states like Connecticut, and certainly into New York too, you know, 40, 50, 60% urban tree cover is not unusual. And again, that's because our lands typically revert to forested cover in and of itself. So because of the work that they've done, it's allowed us to understand important benefits associated with trees and what they actually do. It's also allowed us to understand this through the lens of money, right, from the economic standpoint. That's what iTree has really empowered us to do since it came online back in 2006. It's allowed us to understand that if we can quantify air pollution and the values related to air pollution, values related to carbon, you know, through many types of analysis by resource economists and those sorts of folks, things that are absolutely outside of my field of understanding. But if we can marry that to understanding what trees do in terms of sequestering and storing carbon, can't we start to get a dollar value for some of these benefits? And of course, the answer is yes. And we can actually do that on a pretty individual level. We can do it not only on a national level, but a state by state level, and indeed a community by community level. And there's a great new suite in iTree called Our Trees, and that actually allows you to look up the benefits associated with trees in your particular community just by putting an address in there. So you can see, of course, states that benefit greatly from trees and their ability to remove pollution from the air: California, Florida, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio. Lots of different factors go into these very complex analysis: population, air pollution issues, problems, again, forest cover, all of those things sort of come together. You'll often see Vermont at the bottom for a lot of these. That's because there's just not a lot of people in the state of Vermont. Very rural, very sparsely populated state. From the carbon sequestration standpoint, again, we see the hundreds of millions of dollars per year on a state-by-state basis that this work by Nowak and Greenfield has allowed us to understand. And I'll kind of put this together. I'll summarize this at the very end. So I don't think we need to necessarily start listing states individually here, but again, hundreds of millions of dollars and sort of a state by state basis in terms of trees ability, urban trees ability to sequester carbon. So sequestering carbon, we're referring to trees as they grow every year, they sequester more and more carbon. That's a little bit different than the stored carbon, the total carbon that a tree stores. Again, you get into larger, older trees, they're not necessarily growing as much, so they're not sequestering as much carbon, but they're storing a lot more carbon. And so the environmental benefits of larger trees are orders of magnitude more than smaller trees. And we get into these sorts of things at the ordinance level in communities, at least here in Massachusetts, where some communities that want to protect their urban tree canopy cover, they'll say things like, okay, if you want to try to remove a 30-inch sugar maple, I'm just throwing out an example here, you need to plant 15 2-inch trees, 15 smaller trees, right, juvenile trees that come from a nursery to quote unquote make up for that. And some communities have much more stringent requirements than sort of a one-for-one example like what I just gave you. There may be communities with several times more than that, but our understanding is that large mature trees, the environmental benefits that come from them are orders of magnitude more than smaller trees. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when you get into things like wildlife habitat and aesthetics and those sorts of things. So just a quick little take home then is, if you want to be active in terms of the environmental benefits associated with trees in your community, be active in terms of protecting green spaces and protecting mature trees. Energy conservation, again, we think of something like, why would Florida be at the top there? They probably use a lot of air conditioning in Florida. So trees are important in terms of benefits related to energy conservation, shading, cooling, evapotranspiration, which of course is known to actually cool the air around you. So it doesn't surprise me at the least that a state like Florida would rank really high on that list as it relates to energy conservation. And then of course, avoided emissions, a little bit along those lines where we're avoiding the emissions from those sorts of power plant settings. Again, Florida's right kind of at the top of that list there as well. And that does not surprise me in the least. And so when we start to talk about totals here, and I'll put a slide up after this that will actually kind of summarize things quite nicely. Again, Florida's here at the top, and we looked at those 4 benefits that I just passed through very briefly. We can see here sort of a little bit of a state-by-state basis, at least in a top 5 and a lower 5, if you will. It's just important to keep in mind that there are simply some environments like the Southwest, like a Utah, for example, they just don't grow a lot of trees. And out in those sorts of areas, there's not a lot of water, not a lot of moisture to support tree populations. So we want to kind of be cognizant, again, of what I mentioned earlier about a forested biome. We want to be cognizant of sort of what the environment's proclivity is around us in terms of its natural state. And so to kind of summarize things, when we talked about air pollution removal, energy conservation, carbon sequestration, avoided emissions, we total those all together, we see billions of dollars of benefits. In fact, we put them together, the sum total is almost $20 billion a year, getting upwards of $20 billion. In fact, after inflation, I'm sure that's very much the case, since this number is now 3 or 4 years old. And part of the challenge is, in addition to communicating to folks what billions of dollars look like, right? Since many of us don't understand that, is that the benefits of trees are really important. Large trees, mature trees, the environmental benefits are orders of magnitude more than small juvenile trees. The other sort of part of the equation that's a little bit troubling is that our impervious surfaces, again, going back to some of that work the Forest Service is doing, looking at those aerial photographs, those FIA plots, those sorts of things, ground truthing this information, is that we are actually seeing an increase in impervious surfaces. And I don't think this surprises most of us when we think of things like development, construction, those sorts of things that are going on in neighborhoods, in communities, that sort of thing. In fact, we're seeing an impervious surface increase over the 5 years that they looked at this, from 2009 to 2014. It was up by 1%, and their urban tree canopy cover continues to drop. So that's something to be aware of. In fact, it's dropping at the order of $100 million a year in terms of the benefits that come from these trees, or 36 million trees per year, what is actually a total of 175,000 acres per year. So it's just important to keep in mind that trees produce a lot of important benefits. Mature trees produce a lot of important benefits in and of themselves, but that we are losing nationwide urban tree canopy cover, and we are also gaining impervious surfaces. That's important for a whole number of issues: heat island effect, runoff, carbon sequestration in and of itself, all of those sorts of things are relevant. And so we just sort of, it's not that I want to be alarmist about the work that I'm involved in and doing, but that it's just important to keep that in mind. We see, of course, this comparison from years where the Forest Service took initial readings of urban tree canopy cover and then went back. And you can see virtually each of these communities across the country, urban tree canopy cover dropped, with the exception, look at the right, not the far right, but the second to the right, where Syracuse actually gained urban tree canopy cover. And that's a couple of reasons. One is the main reason is because when they started the initial data collection in the early 2000s, there was the big ice storm back in the late 90s. That was back whenever I was in forestry school. In fact, I remember escaping from Ottawa on a plane that morning to Thunder Bay, Ontario, where I was an undergrad. And if I hadn't been able to do that, I would have been home for almost, I think it was almost 3 weeks that things were sort of waylaid, if you will. So lots of my fellow students were stuck in southern and eastern Ontario. And of course, as you can imagine, in Syracuse, upstate New York, sort of geographically, very similar area. But after that, they had lost a lot of trees. They took the data in terms of urban tree canopy cover in the early 2000s. So they actually saw a regrowth of that, but that was natural regeneration. It wasn't that people were running around planting lots of trees. And that's important to keep in mind too, is that natural regeneration is an important part of our urban forests and our urban tree canopy cover, especially again in areas that are natural forested biomes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some cases here to try to unpack a little bit about how we can enhance, how we can protect our urban trees and the benefits associated with them, because again, we need healthy trees in order to generate those benefits that we are sort of talking about. So this is, I said before, I reached back into my files, and this is actually one of the wonderful things about working at Cornell is that we had the opportunity, working at the extension in Westchester, we had the opportunity to travel all over Westchester and of course parts of New York City and even out into Long Island, doing site visits for contractors as part of our commercial site visit program. So we were actually over in the far west part of Long Island here, over in Long Island City actually. And with this particular site visit, this was a location that we went to. So this would have been Jerry and I. We would have went to this location referred to as Dutch Kills Green. It was an urban oasis with wetlands and green space. If you look this up on Google Maps, and you can actually see this nice aerial shot right here. And so when we were called out here, it was an early development site. There was lots of things going on, lots of issues going on. You can see this tree on the right-hand side. This tree is obviously not doing well with the dead foliage right here. So there's, and of course we know that plants, whenever when there's an early installation and in those early years and they're becoming established, they don't necessarily look so great, if you will. So we were out on this particular site right here. This was actually a parking lot that was being made into a park, made into that, as I said before, the Dutch Kills Green Urban Oasis, just referred to as the Urban Oasis. But basically this was made into being constructed into a green space here. And so just keep your eye on that right tree, or just remember that, put that in the back of your mind here. So we of course walked around this particular location. This is a pretty high stress site. A lot of these contracts were really important contracts to the contractors that had called us out. Our objective was to simply provide unbiased information. The beautiful thing about extension, right, is you don't have an agenda. So we were out here to try to provide some unbiased information, give them some help related to what's going on with all of these trees that are dying. There were some real issues related to these trees. And this was just a few weeks after they had been installed, a few weeks after they had been planted. They obviously weren't doing very well at all. And actually where that individual is biking on the left-hand side, and if you were to walk on the right-hand side, underneath those two strips of pavement was actually structural soil. So they put a lot of time and a lot of money into designing and into constructing something that they were hoping was going to be a success, if you will. So when we were digging around here, and that's actually me, and that's actually one of our fleet vehicles at the time. I'm not sure if that's been replaced yet, but anyways, you can see, I just look at this tree right here, especially over to the left of that wooden structure, and you can see how thick the stem is on that tree. That's a really big tree for somebody to be installing, and you really need to know what you're doing. You really have a real important plan, a real solid plan in place. You want to see a tree like that survive. So we were looking through the entire area, and this is what it's a simple tool that I use in the field. referred to as, some folks call them steel arrows, but they're known as chaining pins or survey pins. And you can see they have inch delineations. They're about 22 inches in length. And so you can see the size of that root ball right there, probably isn't a whole lot more than, it'd be maybe 30 inches or so. So 2.5 feet or whatever, the terms of a diameter. And you can see how thick those trees are, right? 4 to 6 inches in caliper. So really thick, really large trees that they're installing there. This was Jerry on the other side where we saw that person biking. Again, we've got a whole array of red oak right here. Now, red oak are notoriously difficult to transplant in and of themselves. And so I'm looking at these trees right here. I don't see any sort of moisture, any sort of plan in terms of watering these trees. And these are, again, really big trees. And there's not a lot of space on either side in terms of a little alley for them to grow. On either side of that, the pavement there doesn't leave a lot of space in the middle. So he was digging around, and of course, this is our trusty penetrometer. So I've mentioned a couple little tools off the top right here, little trawl or a little, trowel or trawl, however you want to pronounce that, a penetrometer, a garden claw. That's very helpful for digging soil away from the base of a tree. And so we deal a lot, as we know, in the urban environment with compacted soil. And I mentioned earlier about how they were trying to work around that with this particular setting because of the structural soil that they had brought in, engineered soil. And there are different types of engineered soils, and we get into that into our urban forestry class up here that I teach. I teach our capstone class. It's simply called community forestry, and it's NRC 310. That's our urban forestry class. And we have students from all sorts of walks of life, including our urban forestry students in that class. And we get into this issue, of course, related to compaction and trying to understand. It's not that I'm a soil scientist, but we're trying to understand how soils impact trees and impact plants from a plant health standpoint. And also soils are an important carbon storage site in terms of the planet and climate change and carbon and all of those sorts of issues. So a healthy soil is really critical. And we know that there's an inverse relationship between root penetration and, of course, resistance. And we get around that 300 PSI, 300 pounds per square inch. And the penetrometer is a pretty simple tool. It's just a dial right here. And so you shove it in the soil and put some pressure on it. And once that needle starts to hit the red area right here, that means there can be problems related to your plants. Now, can that vary depending on plant to plant? Sure, some plants are more tolerant of compacted soil than others. Certainly time of the year, if the soil is more moist, it's going to move through the soil more quickly versus when the soil is dry. But at least it's an important reference point and a great tool. And of course, we can also come into this from an understanding related to bulk density. Soil bulk density in the range of 1.4 to 1.65 grams per cubic centimeter. So it's a volume per weight ratio, can limit the growth of woody plants, right? And this comes from a paper. I wish I had, I wish I could claim some funds every time I quote this paper, because I think I could put our kids through university with that. But this is a very helpful paper, and I'm happy to pass along any references that anyone might want to take a look at as I move through this talk right here. And like I said, we'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. So in terms of soil composition, we know that soils are about 50% porous, right? We know that between things like air and space for solution and organic matter, what have you, soils are not this entirely solid surface that people think that they are. And this is actually a desire line. So this is just on campus right here. And you can see as you move further away from the line, from this path, that the grass health actually starts to increase. But right next to the path, you'll see, of course, plantain and prostate knotweed, and that's because the soil is compacted. And so the solution, of course, to something like this would be to mix in some compost, right? Compacted soil, the solution to compacted soil is mixing in compost, and of course, the ability to take a proper field test, 10 to 15 subsamples. This is a soil sleeve on the left-hand side. I've used these countless times over the years doing site visits, and of course, up here with our students. And of course, this is the Cornell pH kit is a great kit. It's something that I still use. I still work with the soils folks. They still graciously send this stuff to me from the Cornell lab, the bromothymol blue and chlorophenol red. Very, very helpful in terms of field testing. So between things like pH testing, between things like a penetrometer, you can get a good handle on what's happening to the soils in your field. And you can actually see on the right-hand side of that picture, that's actually a cup cutter from a golf course. And I use that for perk testing as well. So this is all important field stuff that I use to try to capture factors like pH and understand compaction. And you can see here, of course, as we all know, as our pH increases, as it's prone to do in the urban environment because of things like salts and leachate from concrete and foundations, as that moves up, then of course, iron, manganese, those other important elements become less available, as you see here on the left-hand side, with probably iron chlorosis, but could also be manganese deficiency in this red maple on the left-hand side. So I always walk people through a nice nutrient analysis report. When I started up here, these were being printed from the soils lab with a dot matrix printer. It was awful. It was just a bunch of numbers everywhere. And that's what I made our students in our plant healthcare class, which I used to teach, interpret. But of course, I get to walk people through this really nice nutrient analysis report now that they've since changed and updated here at UMass. So I tell people, again, pay attention to your pH, right? Hopefully you've properly taken a sample, 10 to 15 subsamples. We're using our soil tube, and in the area where that might differ, if physical conditions differ. So if you have a shady backyard versus a sunny front yard, you might want 2 separate samples. And again, 10 to 15 subsamples in each of those areas. Bulk density. So I mentioned earlier that Alberti report, this becomes problematic at 1.4 to 1.65 grams per cubic centimeters. This is not there yet. Here's our soil organic matter. We want that to be somewhere around 5%, don't we? We also talk a little bit about cation exchange capacity up here. So this number anywhere around 30 to 100 is actually generally an accepted value. So we can keep that sort of thing in the back of our mind in terms of cation exchange in the upper right-hand side here at 28.7. But I usually point people to these 4 factors, kind of ending with these essential elements at the bottom. And what's happened with this soil? What may have taken place to cause all the essential elements to be way in the above optimum range? Well, this might be as a result of amending. So whenever compost is administered to the soil, it generally pushes your essential elements way up in terms of a range. So without even having been to the site, a properly interpreted analysis can help us understand what's happened on the site. And you can actually take a look at that. UMass Green Info gets us here where we need to go on campus. And of course, hopefully Cornell's generating some nice reports as well for folks now. So back into the field and back into that urban oasis we were talking about, we also see some issues that I'm going to discuss a little bit later on when we move through this talk right here. But look at the stem of this tree, right? We're paying some close attention as to what's going on right here. I think this was sweet peat mulch, which I'm kind of a fan of. It was ground mulch that they had put here. Some of the shredded mulch knits together, and then the nugget mulch, of course, that can wash away. If people push me into a corner and say, do you prefer nugget mulch versus shredded mulch? I tell people nugget mulch, but this this ground mulch like sweet peat can actually be pretty good. And of course, here I am using my chaining pin right here again to try to get our hands around how well they planted those red oaks in this particular site. This is actually an adventitious root right here. So that can actually throw you for a bit of a loop in terms of proper planting depth, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit later. So what I want to communicate to you is that there are 2 important issues that we encounter in terms of installation, establishing and promoting trees and tree health in the urban environment. The first is the error of design. An error of design, so this actually comes from some statistical research papers that came out back in the 80s, but I love these terms and I bring them into class. So an error of design is an explanation for sort of a broad level, higher level, broad-based type of error. So for example, failing to plan for something. We often see, as I showed you in that little case study a little bit earlier, there really wasn't a plan in place to maintain those trees. So this is a ceremonial tree planting that I was part of here on campus, because every Arbor Day you need to have a ceremonial tree planting. And we have a lot of wonderful resources here on campus. And I just am blessed to have a great relationship with the landscape folks here. And they've actually called me out to take a look at trees in the past. I actually bring them into the class and they actually do some grading for our students. Our students do a poster presentation every year on the communities that they get out to when they do a sample inventory. So there's a great relationship with those folks. So an error of design in this case, and in the case I was talking about earlier, is that you need a maintenance plan. And of course, hydration is important, especially with a year like this. This is actually the drought monitor. So again, we don't want to just say to people, quote unquote, we're in a drought. You want to be able to point people to some unbiased information. I use a drought monitor pretty regularly. You can see here in Massachusetts, almost essentially the entire state of Rhode Island was in an extreme drought this year. And you folks down in the Hudson Valley, down in Westchester, same sort of thing. It was pretty dry this summer. So a maintenance plan, these gator bags, it's difficult to get water out to trees, but I am a fan of gator bags. If they're used properly, they're usually about 25 gallons. They take a day or two to empty out. There's perforations in the bottom. And so there's a little bit of a potential for some slow release water on a site. And again, I still use the Northeast Regional Climate Center information at Cornell for daily precipitation for growing degree days. And again, you see with that negative number here, our shortfall in terms of rainfall this summer. In fact, the city of Boston was down around 10 inches in terms of below normal rainfall this year. Another error of design relates to understanding tree spacing. There's not a lot of information, not a lot of understanding out there, or a lack of understanding, whether it's with regular homeowners, regular residents like me, or whether it's with folks in the commercial industry. This is, of course, the classic example. You walk onto a site, you see a truck, you see a car, in this case, an excavator parked right under a tree, because people love to park in shady areas. So I mentioned before, write down that tiny URL. .com. Well, then the suffix in this case will be tree UMN. This is the original, or part of the original, tree protection work that Dr. Gary Johnson had put together in terms of trying to protect trees and understanding what we need for tree spacing. That's, of course, been since updated by ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. You see they're managing trees during construction. That's their best management practice in terms of protecting trees during construction in situations like what we see on the left-hand side. So take that URL down on the right-hand side if you want Gary's free book. It's still very, very useful. One of the most common guides I've given out to folks over the years. So again, we don't have a lot of space between those two paved areas on either side of those trees, and space is a premium in the urban environment. One of the large differences between what goes on in the urban environment and what goes on in the traditional forested setting. So this is a great book. The suffix here is tree space design, or the ending. This is a book that's put out by Casey Trees called Tree Space Design. And you can see here, we get into the math in some of my classes, in our urban forestry class, definitely back in our plant healthcare class. But you can see here, they've differentiated with those trees on the right-hand side between the soil volume needed for a small tree, a medium tree, and a large tree. Soil volume for a small tree, little over 100 cubic feet. A medium tree, I look at that and I see maybe a red maple that's 20 feet or so in diameter. And then our larger trees, you need at least 1,000 cubic feet. And so we get into how that's calculated from a mathematical standpoint. A lot of that's based on Nina Bassick and Peter Trowbridge's research, but this is a very helpful guide. And again, I point people to this very helpful resource. And again, that's open source. So understanding how much space trees need and trying to get our hands around that equation, because when you're dealing with engineers and planners, right, trying to advocate for trees, since they obviously can't advocate for themselves, and we think of hardscapes in cities, and we think of the sewage systems and the underground systems that are very complex, and those are naturally part of the thought process for engineers and for planners, but trees maybe not so much. So whatever can be done to encourage as much space as possible, as we see here on the right-hand side, is helpful for trees in the urban environment in terms of mitigating the heat island, in terms of carbon sequestration and carbon storage and stormwater runoff and all of those sorts of things. We also have some serious errors that we've made in terms of our selection habits. Here in Massachusetts, down in New York, down in New Jersey, if you see any of the work that Nina and Fred Cowett have done, we know that we have great uniformity in the urban environment. We think of and there's debate and discussion in the tree world about what sort of the appropriate amount of a genus there should be. And somewhere between 5 and 20%. So we have here in Massachusetts well into the 40s in terms of percentages of our trees, or of our urban trees, being some sort of maple. So one of my graduate students, her name was Ashley, she put together this great guide. So we actually now have an urban tree selection guide here in Massachusetts called Planting for Resilience, and you can download that. You add tree select to the end of tinyurl.com. If I come down sometime, I'm happy to try to bring some copies with me, or if you're up here in the Pioneer Valley, you're welcome to stop by and pick one up. I know a few of you down there have even gone to school up here, so you're welcome to stop by, and I'm happy to hand you a copy. But again, we have a situation here where we have 2/3 of our trees in Massachusetts being some sort of a maple or some sort of an oak. That's problematic as it relates to, of course, pests, right? You sort of see what I'm driving at right here with our Asian longhorn beetle. Nothing new about this sort of discussion, right? Obviously struggled with this down in New York. Ground zero for this was in Worcester, and then the 2008 find where the city removed over 30,000 trees commencing after the find in 2008. So that was the pre, this is the post shot right here. And so lots of studies going on in these areas right here. I'm actually working with some of the specialists, some of the folks at Clark University to try to get a handle on things like how this impacts utility consumption. We're real interested. We actually had a similar phenomenon occur in Springfield here in Massachusetts, in a little bit more of the western part of the state, where there was a tornado that came through here just the year before I started. It came through in June 2011. That area has since started to regrow because there were over 1,200 trees that were planted. And so we're actually at one of our new graduate students, Candace, is going to be heading out there to do some research interviews with folks. So from a tree selection standpoint, it's really important to just recommend variety and varying our selection choices. This is where I start to say things like, don't reinvent the wheel. The Society of Municipal Arborists puts out a tree of the year. They've been doing this now for over 20 years. This is the tree of the year for 2022, Carpinus caroliniana, blue beech or musclewood. It's a great small tree. It's a tough tree. There's some great cool varieties that are out there. Look at the ripples in the bark. It kind of reminds me of muscle tissue. You can see the small nutlets here on the right-hand side in terms of fruit. This tree is going to probably be compatible with utility lines. Utility lines usually at least 30 feet in height. So this is a smaller tree, an understory tree, but a great tree, I think, for a lot of nice plantings in the urban environment. So this is definitely an underutilized tree. And the more, I think, variety that we can introduce to the urban environment in terms of that sort of a palette, it's important to sort of create as much a margin as possible as it relates to things like Asian longhorn beetle, and of course, emerald ash borer. And of course, many of us even think back to years past with Dutch elm disease, right? So some nice new varieties. It's really cool to take a look through the resources provided by Schmidt and some of the other nurseries. Lots of folks demand beautiful fall color. That's what folks have been selecting for. This is a 2020 tree of the year. This is hackberry. It's a beautiful floodplain tree. The tree, when it makes it into the urban environment, tends to be a little bit rattier. I've heard people say, oh, that's a kind of a dog of a tree. I really like Celtis occidentalis down the Hudson Valley. It's part of their native range. I actually stumbled across some of my annual hiking excursion in the Adirondacks this year down near the, we're at one of the locations down near the Hudson River. But these are a beautiful tree as well. They get a little larger, of course, but a great tree for a park or a landscape if there's room. And of course, it's actually a member of the elm family. You can see the oblique base of the leaves right here, kind of reminiscent of our American elms, if you will. And of course, there are different varieties that are out there in the urban environment. What did I say earlier is a premium? Space is a premium. So a lot of demand for upright trees and tighter fitting trees like prairie sentinel, for example. And then of course, our hop hornbeam, our other ironwood, people sometimes call blue beech ironwood, what people call Austria virginiana, of course, ironwood. Another small understory tree, beautiful fruits. I took this actually at a peach farm just north of us here. So living in the Pioneer Valley is wonderful in that there's agriculture all around us. And so we were out picking some peaches and I took this one day. It's a really nice understory tree that's translated well to the urban environment. Can be difficult to get started, but if it's cared for, if there's a plan in place to maintain these sorts of trees, and again, there's that more of an upright structure with this variety autumn treasure, then I think that these definitely hold great promise. So part of what I want to kind of drive home today as we start to wrap things up is really some of these quotes from some of these greats, if you will, right? We think of like Alex Shigo. If one day we were to know everything there is to know about the above ground portion of the tree, we still only know half the story. He wasn't even a root specialist. He was a pathologist. It's not that he didn't know about tree roots, but that wasn't really, as my understanding, his area of research. So what have we found since then, right? Well, our own Taryn Bowerly from Cornell, she says greater than 40% of a tree's biomass is below ground. She is a root specialist. And then, of course, we think about Gary Watson's statement here. Over 80% of all landscape tree problems start below ground. This is a great text, by the way, on the right-hand side. If you wanted to pick this up at some point, applied tree biology from the folks in England from Andy Hirons and Peter Thomas. So I mentioned errors of design. I want to mention here as we start to close, errors of execution, where, remember when I showed you earlier that picture of that large tree in terms of its caliper, but not a very large root ball probably 30 inches or so, something like that. So if there's a tree of that size, the root ball diameter should probably upwards of 4 to 5 feet in terms of an actual diameter. And so if you can actually get your hands on the nursery standards that are out there, there's some great tables in there. So you can see tinyurl.com/nursery standard. This picture on the upper right-hand side, I take our students every year to one of our local nurseries. There's actually on-site tree production here in the Pioneer Valley, which is wonderful. So we're out here at Amherst Nurseries, and so we're actually seeing trees being dug. And when they're dug, I'm not using it as an example here, but that's often the case in nurseries, is that they're not dug with a large enough root ball. So planting smaller individual trees is generally a best practice. As a rule of thumb, if you have a choice between tree A and tree B, all else being equal, plant the smaller individual tree. And again, so if we have a caliper size of 4 to 6 inches, you can see there you really should have a root ball diameter between 4 and 5 feet. And you can look that up in the nursery stand. Now, why do I have all these standards at my fingertips? Because Rick Harper's word is important to one person in the conversation, Rick Harper. The other person on the other end of the line wants you to show them something in print, something that's actually being produced. And that's why I have these sorts of things after all of these years. So in terms of errors of execution, we see also improper digging, we see improper installation, we see trees that have just too much soil around the base, as I sort of alluded to earlier when we were talking about that adventitious root of that red oak. We should, of course, see that nice flare on the right-hand side, not that telephone pole that we see here on the left-hand side. What do we know about current planting practices? Well, there's a nice study that came out in 2006, and unfortunately, I don't think a lot has changed since then, but over 90% of landscape trees, these are actually trees that were installed by professionals, feature excessive soil on top of the roots. And then now starts, of course, the pointing of the fingers, right? They came from the nursery with too much soil on them. The arborist planted it too deeply. The landscaper that maintains it put too much mulch around the base of the tree, right? We're all familiar with volcano mulching. I think that we're all guilty, and that getting this information out and correcting at the time of planting, that's sort of the important point to kind of take home from this. So we need to keep that in mind, because again, digging practices, planting practices, they can end up in where we have situations like this with bald and burlap trees where there's not a lot of roots because there's a lot of soil on top of the trees, perhaps at the time of being dug. Certainly whenever they're being wrapped up, you can see this picture I took on the right-hand side here. There's a lot of excess soil. You know, if you look at some of the literature, they talk about 3 to 4 inches of excess soil. I think it's easily twice that, in my personal opinion. We've all walked through parking lots where we see that little gap on the bottom right-hand side there, because again, there's too much mulch or too much soil around the base of the tree. So we need to be especially cognizant of this as it relates to bald and burlap trees. And of course, properly planting trees comes up really regularly, and we get a chance to do that in class with our landscape folks that take our students outside. We have a great relationship with our city forester here in Amherst, Alan Snow, who's actually a tree warden. We have tree wardens all over Massachusetts. So you can see here on the left-hand side, this is Alex Sherman. He's actually the tree warden or city forester down in Springfield. He is going around the base of the tree, right? It's a practice that I actually learned from Nina Bassick and Andy Hillman, but basically he's going around the entirety of the bottom of the tree, and he's cutting all of the wire and then popping that bottom portion off. In fact, you can see here in this tree on the upper right-hand side, and you'll see I've got my glove on, I'm heading up the side of the tree. There's no cage on the bottom. You see how I've kind of cut that on the bottom right-hand side in that photo? The bottom has no cage left on it. So if you do that, if you cut the bottom of the cage off first and leave it intact on the side, that lets you move the tree around. So expose the bottom, tip the tree over, remove the bottom, make sure that you are digging your hole to the correct depth, and then place the tree in the hole. If you need to pull it back out, you can do that because you still have the cage on the side. So make sure you have the appropriate depth there. Put it in the hole and then run up the side like a zipper, and you have quickly and properly removed all of that cage. And then of course I just tamp the burlap down. So Just make sure, as you see on the left-hand side on the bottom, that you're using your chaining pins, you're using your garden claw, you're getting an idea of how much excessive soil is on top of those roots. But in my opinion, 6 to 10 inches is not unusual. Don't let those adventitious roots throw you. As you see in the upper left-hand side there, that is not the root flare. The root flare, of course, is where the preponderance of roots are coming out. As you see, that's remedied in the upper right-hand side. So put the tree in the ground, water the tree, and it's called mudding the tree in, and then come up with your plan to properly maintain that tree. Make sure it's getting moisture and pruning, and you're scouting it for pests. If you can inspect some of those roots, that's really important. But these are just some important tips to help abate against some of the errors of execution that we've been talking about. So this is just a creative solution from some of our site visits in the urban environment. A really large 72-inch red oak tree, and there were some folks who wanted to do a lot of cutting around the soil. One of the things that we ended up suggesting is actually burying some of the infrastructure deeply, at least 3 feet deep underneath that tree. So that was sort of something that we come up with. Folks wanted to carve up a lot of that soil, but again, we know that roots grow wide, they don't grow deep. So if you can actually do some of your work below that root system, that's something to keep in mind. This is actually a site that we were on, and we ended up, the homeowner wanted to remove these trees, the arborist didn't. The homeowner contended that there was a moisture problem. You see that the drainage location in the middle of the driveway right there. One of the things we suggested was digging a dry well, using some steel reinforcement around that dry well to keep the tree roots out of it, and filling that with crushed rock to sort of encourage draining. So again, you come up with these solutions in these wonky environments because trees aren't really native to cities. So these are actually like large Dawn redwood trees right here. And then understanding a little bit about health rating. How do we sort of qualitatively assess what our trees look like? So there's a great little a tool out there. This is from the folks at iTree from the Forest Service. And you simply see on the left-hand side there the verbiage: good, fair, poor, and dead. And you see the corresponding trees there on the right-hand side. The good being that beech tree sort of in the middle right that's changing color. The fair tree with the somewhat starting to thin canopy, those pine trees. The poor tree, the bottom tree on the left, that pine tree that's definitely in an advanced state of decline. And of course, that dead tree there on the right-hand side. So being able to get our hands around qualitatively describing the health of our trees is really important, because again, our healthy trees are the trees that generate benefits in the urban environment. So we remember these pictures I showed you a little bit earlier. And actually I get to this stage because I want to encourage folks that not all is lost. This is actually that same area in 2014. And the wonderful thing about graduate students, this is AJ Elton. He's our most recent graduate student. AJ wrapped up his master's in May of this year. He's now the city forester for Providence, Rhode Island, which required a graduate degree. So I'm so excited to see AJ there. But he lives in Worcester and took this picture for me. So I'm really encouraged to see this area, I believe it's the Burncoat area in Worcester, New York, actually returning, or Worcester, Massachusetts, returning to some semblance of having some urban tree canopy cover, which is really exciting. So you can go to my webcast archive section of my monthly webcast, urbanforestrytoday.org. You can listen to a couple great lectures by Dr. Dave Nowak, who will talk much more about this and has done the firsthand research on the benefits of trees and our understandings of urban tree canopy cover in the urban environment. You, of course, can take in a number of other lectures, again, important and relative to trees and promoting tree health, so that trees can then generate those important environmental services that we so desire and so need in this day and age where we're concerned, obviously, with things like climate change and what have you. Another nice talk by Bryant Sharon-Brock from the University of Wisconsin talking about site assessment and soils and all of those sorts of things. And that's all at the urbanforestrytoday.org website. And then this is the slide that I'm happy to hang out on if folks have any questions, because I think I left us at least 5 minutes for questions.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question here. Do you remove the adventitious roots before planting?
Yes.
And let's see, that's really the only question I see. Oh, here's another one. What if you realize now that you've planted a tree too deep last year? How to fix?
it can be very challenging. So that's where we get into, and I did not talk about this today. We've got the time to cover, the things that we can cover, and we didn't get into using air tools or air knives, air spades, but those can be very important for removal of soil on a site. You're obviously not going to change the entire grade of drainage on a site, but you can certainly remove soil locally using an air spade. So an air tool, I get an arborist who offers that service, and avail them of an air spade or an air tool or an air knife, basically compressed air, to come in and to remove that soil. Many of us are, I mean, they've been in the trade now for 20 years. And I remember when they were coming out, Bartlett was doing some of the early trials on them. They came from the military for removing landmines. So they're going to be pretty innocuous to roots.
Okay, thank you. Oh, here's another. We want to hire an arborist to look over all the trees on our property and help us keep them healthy. How do I find a good one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm trying to remember now, this might get into Hillary's and Amy's territory. If the New York State arborists, they probably have a list of ISA certified arborists. And then of course, the usual sort of rule of thumb of reaching out to 3 contractors and having visitations from 3 contractors, and then going with the one that you feel most comfortable with is good practice. Is there anything else you direct folks to on that front, Amy?
Yeah, we would tell people to contact the ISA and International Society of Arboriculture, and there's a New York chapter to find people in our location. We don't recommend specific companies. So the idea of asking at least 3 people for their advice is helpful. And we can help people sort out the advice if it's conflicting or if it's just different, and because there are a lot of different ways to approach certain issues.
Well said, Amy.
Mhm. Okay, I have another question here. You haven't talked about deer. Do you have any suggestions for protecting trees from them?
Oh, dear. Yeah, there's that great new material out that Paul Curtis has been working with, right? It's some type of animal fat. I don't know, there's supposed to be a new, Amy, do you know about that? A new deer repellent that he's been using? It's not that old, like a year or 2 he's been working with it.
I'm not real familiar with it, no.
Okay.
But
So there,
he does do some presentations, so we'll keep our eyes out for that.
Okay,
And-
someone wrote a sheep animal fat is what someone just wrote.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can get him to come for our lecture series too.
Yeah, the
and talk
challenge is,
about
right,
that.
those numbers are so high. What is it they say, in Westchester, they're 40 to 50 per square mile, or even more than that. And so, even those deer resistant plant lists are, what would we say, Amy, have minimal use in some
Mhm.
cases.
Right. The deer don't read the list.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and if they find out that something's palatable, maybe they just ignored it because they weren't familiar with something. But if they're really hungry and find out something is palatable, they'll go for it. So without fencing, it's hard to keep them out. There are things that they like less than others that they'll ignore unless they're really starving. So we have lists that may be helpful in that respect. But I do suggest that people try one and see how it goes before they spend a lot of money on a lot of any one thing.
Okay. Amy, I have 2 more questions. Do we have time?
I'm fine to listen. Sure.
Okay. Bedford Hills, New York has removed all of its downtown trees, telling the public that there is not enough room for the trees to grow. Are you familiar, perhaps, with what tree they will replant in the many empty spaces that were created?
Well, I'm not familiar personally. Maybe Amy, a little bit more about that than I do. I haven't heard anything about that, but
Okay.
I'd mentioned a couple of smaller species suggestions in my talk a little bit earlier, and folks are welcome to take a look at our tree selection guide that we have here as well. I don't know anything about the particulars. Do you know the particulars about that, Amy?
No, but the Cornell Urban Horticulture Institute also has small trees, lists of small trees that can grow under power lines and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nina's woody plant database is great.
Yes. Yes. And we are at the top of the hour. And I don't know, Rick, if there are more questions, if you want us to hang on, I have a couple of slides, parting slides for people who have to go. If Hillary, if you wouldn't mind sharing those. If if you have to move on, Rick, we can follow up afterward with people as well. Okay, oops, and yeah, okay, that's what I would be doing. I just want to thank everybody for showing up today and kicking off our 30th year sessions and seeing Dr. Harper, who's been great. Next month we have edible gardening with Carolyn Ramsey, Master Gardener Volunteer, who also does a great job. And next slide, we hope to see you next month. The next slide, please. Just thanking our donors for helping to support this series and the rest of Cooperative Extension. And your gift is much appreciated. Thank you very much. And we can go back to answering questions if Rick is still here.
Sure.
Thank you very much. And if you have to go, we will follow up shortly.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here. Is removing girdling roots ever detrimental to the health of the tree?
Yeah, so I mean, removing any tissue from a tree is not desirable, but the idea is that you are endeavoring to take the pain right now to preclude a much more serious situation in the future. So trees, of course, that have aberrant roots, circling roots, as they continue to get larger, there's going to be more and more problems as those roots continue to be demanded upon to, move water and essential elements through the tree. And also from a structural standpoint, right? Trees, I've certainly seen trees wholesale falling over in the urban environment. And you see those root systems. I didn't have any pictures of it today, but you see those root systems, of course, it can lead back to some of that those circling root issues.
Okay. And this question just goes back to the trees you were showing us in Queens. Whatever happened, or Long Island rather, whatever happened to the space in New York City with the dead trees? Did you plant smaller trees and did they flourish?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't often get chances for follow-ups and those kinds of things. And that's in fact something that I suggest to folks, especially if you own a good sized property and you're there, pay good attention to those plants, because you get that that annual knowledge that sort of builds up over the years. But they did switch out species. They opted for some linden trees, those areas that were looking pretty sparse, filled in with some of those ornamental grasses. So I did have a chance to take a look at what they had done at a later point, and certainly it's expensive. The big problem, of course, is they'd spend a lot of time trying to design that site, went to great lengths to move engineered soil, structural soils into that. So there's a lot of money that went into that location. But what had happened was when those trees were dug, and I mentioned earlier about the chain of custody, they were dug with the root balls too small. They were essentially killed whenever they were dug. And so that's why I always encourage people to think about a smaller specimen, to take more soil if it's at all possible, and of course make sure that there's a plan in place for properly maintaining those trees. But yes, they did replant with other trees.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions.
Okay, and that material from Paul Curtis is called Trico, Trico. That's the material that he's been working on.